Good morning. This is Annette with Non-Boring History on Substack. And today I'm delighted to welcome Alison M. Parker. She's chair of the Department of History and the Richards Professor of American History at the University of Delaware, where she's also co-chair of the University of Delaware's Anti-Racism Initiative. Alison is the author of Unceasing Militant, The Life of Mary Church Terrell, right there. And that was chosen as one of the best Black history books of 2020 by the African American Intellectual History Society. This interview is for readers of Non-Boring History on Substack, which is a newsletter. I've already written about Alison's book on non-boring history. So if you would like to read that before you watch this, then can I warmly suggest you sign up for Non-Boring History on Substack. Just Google it. You'll find it. Welcome, Alison. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks. I'm delighted to be here.
Terrific. So let's launch right in. Mary Church Terrell, major figure in civil rights and also in women's rights. She was very well known in her lifetime. Why do you think she's been in the historical shadows for so long?
I think there are a lot of reasons. There are many really important Black women who have remained in the shadows of history. But the other thing is that she had a very respectable demeanor and presentation. And because she was the first president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which was an organization that actually had a quite progressive and sometimes even radical agenda in terms of its anti-lynching and pro-suffrage positions and anti-segregation positions for things like the streetcars and everything else. It also was an organization where she created the slogan of lifting while we climb. And that was taken to mean that she was one-dimensionally an elitist and not of the people. And this is where I think there was a misunderstanding. And so she's been dismissed as somebody who was not representative of Black women at the time.
And yet one of the things I found very interesting in your book was that you made it very clear that the rank and file of the National Association of Colored Women regarded her as someone they wanted to speak for them. So where did this go wrong? Where did people start to sort of pigeonhole her as an elitist?
When I first started writing about her, it was for a different book I was working on Black and white women's political thought in the 19th century. And I picked her as one of the Black women who I was going to examine. And of course, I was reading biographies of all the women because I wanted to know a little bit about who they were before I started talking about their political thought. However, when I looked at Mary Church Terrell's for a biography, all I could find was her autobiography. And then I also found a lot of books for children and for teenagers. And I was surprised by that because I was surprised that somebody who was one of the only two Black women who helped co-found the NAACP along with Ida B. Wells Barnett, it was really unclear why she wouldn't have had a biography. When I read the biographies for children, which I did do, I saw that they all had a typical trajectory. And the trajectory was to say, all right, she was conservative as a young adult and young person. And then when she was very old, so they skip from when she was in her 30s to when she was in her 80s and early 90s. And they say then she became radicalized in her old age. And that's when she took direct action against segregation. And it's a nice story because it kind of implies that you're not going to do those kind of things if you have any thing to worry about, any stake in society at an earlier moment, and that it's only when you're just about to die and it's all over that you can take that radical action. And it just didn't seem to ring true. Even before I had done a huge amount of work on her, that just didn't seem like a likely scenario. And that's what made me want to look at her more carefully to see what was really up with her story, since she had been given this one particular narrative arc over and over and over again in these children's biographies.
It's such an interesting thought. I'd never read any of the children's books about her, but I present in schools, and I put together what I call one of my college lectures for kids, in this case, middle schoolers and fifth graders. And I talk about her based actually on my recollection of what I read of her autobiography, I think. And, that you get the impression from that and from stuff online that she was when in 1913, when they had the Women's March at the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, that Black women were completely sidelined, and that, Alice Paul tried to tell her, don't come. And Mary Church Terrell, I imagine, saying, no, we're coming, but agreeing to segregation. So, I'm trying to sort of wonder how much she, in some ways, may have crafted this narrative inadvertently herself.
Perhaps to some degree, in the sense that the autobiography obviously leaves out key things and is more like an extended curriculum vitae. It's like
Yes.
an attempt to show the accomplishments of a Black woman who was born enslaved. So really, that was a key goal for her. She was born enslaved in Memphis, Tennessee during the Civil War, and as was Ida B. Wells Barnett the same year. And so they both came from this situation of enslavement, with their parents having been enslaved as well. And that informed her understanding of how she needed to navigate in a predominantly white world. Her book was called A Colored Woman in a White World. And another title she had for it at one point was A Rocky Road. And one of the things that I think she was trying to do was to say, I speak 5 languages. I taught Latin in high school and college. So there is a lot of that, and it's not necessarily done out of egotism. She was writing speeches, and the ones that the Black women in the audiences loved were her talk about the progress of colored women, is what she called it, right? And so it's this notion of where have we come given where we started. And so that was a lot of what I think she was thinking about in that autobiography. But I wanted to get back to the point you mentioned about the parade, because that was something really interesting. She was inspired by the suffragettes across the ocean. She really liked the Pankhursts, and she had visited there and had actually seen Emmeline Pankhurst give a talk in DC, and was really excited to think about the possibilities of direct action for suffrage in the United States. And that's one of the arguments that I am trying to say, look, she was doing these kinds of protests, direct action protests, far before 1954, the year she passed away. This was not something new to her. And the parade is one of those examples of a direct action that she was involved in. And it is true that Alice Paul tried to segregate Black women and have them be at the back of the parade. She claimed it wasn't because of her own interests, but because she was trying to bring in white Southern suffragists. In either way, it was a racist act that was highly problematic. And the story we know, and we all, if we know anything about this story of Black women in the suffrage movement, it's the story of Ida B. Wells Barnett defiantly inserting herself into the Illinois contingent of the parade and marching with the white women. And that is 100% true, but it is usually told as an act of solitary defiance. But what I decided to do after I had been working on the biography for quite a while is to look into what really happened, because it was another point that kept not ringing true for me. The idea that Mary Church Terrell would have agreed to march at the very back in a segregated unit just didn't make any sense, given her personality. And then also, if she had done it, she would have complained about it for the rest of her life. And so, I just saw absolutely no evidence of that. And so that's what motivated me to take the time like I said, when I was pretty far along in the process of writing her biography, to go back to that moment and really try to understand what happened. And that's when I found out that dozens and dozens of Black women marched all throughout the parade according to their professions, because it was divided up in ways where the teachers would march together, the college students. And of course, she negotiated with Alice Paul and Inez Milholland, who was the one who was a lawyer and activist who rode at the front of the parade on a white horse, symbolizing, basically white new womanhood, but she was more progressive. And together they convinced Alice Paul that she had to let the Howard University's new Delta Sigma Theta sorority march together in the parade with the other college women. And then she and the National Association of Colored Women, they marched with the New York State delegation. Now, technically, that was in the back because all of the states were organized to be in the back. So even Ida B. Wells was in the back according to that logic, but it doesn't mean none of them were segregated in the back. And so that was a big moment for me to realize just how much the stereotypes that we have make it hard for us to see what really happened.
And I mean, it all comes down to this evidence. I mean, we're beyond living memory for all of these things. We can't ask anybody who was there. And I mean, that story alone, Alison, was worth the price of the book. It's wonderful. And it really also, Mary Church Terrell, a lot of her significance, as she recognized, was to lay the groundwork for more change, and a sort of institutional groundwork with clubs, involving herself not only in starting the NAACP, but also one of the founders of the NAACP, and as you know, many, many more. The problem with club work, of course, is not terribly sexy, but I mean, you nonetheless show that it's not just about that she, even on the most personal level, got involved in protests. What kinds of challenges did you find in recovering evidence for what happened to her? And what kinds of sources particularly helped you in that?
Well, it's an interesting situation with Mary Church Terrell's biography. She actually had a humongous number of sources available for me to use. And it's the opposite of what you would find for some women or anybody. And that's because as a Black woman who was so aware of the fact that other Black women were never honored and recognized in history, she made a point of doing things like she created a pageant that was performed in the DC school district that was about Phyllis Wheatley, the poet. And so she was always trying to tell about Black foremothers and the history of Black women. And she also wanted her own history told. And she didn't want to be just relying on her autobiography to do that. And so she saved all of her papers. And then she went to the one Black librarian who worked at the Library of Congress. And she got a meeting with him. And she said, I want the Library of Congress to take my papers. And that's got a lot of foresight and a lot of sense of I have meaning in my life and somebody needs to tell it. And so she donated a very large amount of papers to the Library of Congress. And then after her death, her daughter, who was named Phyllis after Phyllis Wheatley, she gave more papers to Howard University's Morgan Spingarn collection. So, and then her family, the Church family in Memphis, has papers at the University of Memphis. So it was actually almost like there was too much. And it's interesting because now it's all digitized and even a lot of it is transcribed. That was certainly not the case when I was working on any of it. So there's a lot more to be done now that the material is so accessible, but that's where it all is. And one time I thought to myself, maybe somebody didn't write her full-length biography because there was too much material. It's overwhelming. So it's the opposite of looking for that tiny scrap of evidence in a newspaper, which is what I'm working on now, is a different project where I have like no papers whatsoever. So I think it's interesting. You can go to either extreme, right?
Well, I am an early Americanist, so welcome to our world. Making much out of very, very little. How did learning more about Mary Church Terrell's family background influence how you saw her? I mean, is that something you talk a lot about in the book?
Yeah, that's another chapter that I did toward the end, and that was the chapter on the history of her family's enslavement and her ancestors. And of course, it's harder to write in terms of getting the material and finding the evidence. And then it's harder to write because it's a brutal history from that matter as well. And one of the things that Mary Church Terrell always talked about was the fact that she wanted to call organizations like the one she was in, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She advocated when the women were creating their group to call it colored women rather than Afro or Afro-American or Negro, which would have been the words of the time that were used as well as colored. But she said that colored better represented what had happened to African women since they had been in America. And she was pointing specifically to the fact that her light skin doesn't reflect her African heritage, but the fact that her enslaved grandmothers had been raped by their white enslavers. And so this is something she talked about not only to Black women, but also to the white audiences that she got access to, partially through her lighter skin color, her elite status in education at Oberlin College. These are things that allowed her to bring up these very uncomfortable topics in those kinds of spaces. But her background made a difference to her, because this is where the argument that she was an elitist who had no understanding of the common person, the average Black woman, just doesn't make any sense, because her own grandmother's stories of enslavement made her cry as a child. And she knew the price that her parents had paid, even though they were so-called privileged during their time as enslaved people, because they worked for their white fathers, usually in either a home or business environment as opposed to in the fields. So in some ways they might have been safer, but obviously rape is a huge danger for women who work inside of the homes of white enslavers. But on top of that, just the emotional distress of her mother, who had to basically be the servant for her half sister, right? So it's a very complicated story, but really what it shows is that when she was thinking about these issues, she was always thinking about what it meant for all Black women to not have proper childcare, not have proper health care, not have all of these things. And then, like Serena Williams today, being an elite Black woman didn't mean that you would get proper health care when you were pregnant. And so she herself experienced a late-term miscarriage, a stillbirth, and then a baby who was born and survived only 2 days because he was placed in an improvised incubator in a segregated DC hospital. So her elite status did not translate into different and special treatment for her. And so when she would go argue that Black women had to become nurses so that they would better treat and care for their Black patients, she was speaking from personal experience and from the trauma of losing 3 babies in a row.
Right. She, I mean, it's such a surprising background for a lot of my readers that she was born into slavery but not raised in it, that her parents became free, she became free, her parents were successful early in life, and yet, light-skinned though she was, it didn't help her much in the climate of Jim Crow in the early 20th century, that things were taking a step back, and her taking her daughters to Oberlin, determined to enroll them in this mostly white college, and finding that things had changed. And you show how she fights that. What strikes me too is she was absolutely committed to integration. I think one misunderstanding that many folks have is that Black organizations, Black colleges didn't start as a deliberate attempt to separate people. They started because there was no choice. And Molly Terrell was among the few who was able to enroll in a predominantly white college. Did her commitment to, basically integration remain consistent throughout her life as a final goal, really?
Yes, because I think she saw segregation, legal segregation, and even informal de facto segregation as being a kind of a harm and a humiliation. And so for her, it was only through proximity and through a kind of status of equality in terms of where can you sit, where can you shop, those kinds of things. So in the 1930s, she participated in the picketing of stores that where Black people were able to buy products but were not able to work in the stores. And so that's before the sit-ins. It's decades before, in fact, that kind of activism, but she was participating in earlier versions. So, I definitely characterize her as part of this long civil rights movement who's working on these issues over time.
I working with the public, I run into a lot of people who are white people who are rushing now to read books about race, and they're often turning to sort of heavily theoretical books written for the public. How might reading history, reading Unceasing Militant, help them better understand the questions that they have?
I think it's helpful to see a Black woman who's both in a personal sense, her personal life struggles, but also her political struggles, and also all of the negotiations and harms and joys that she had over the course of her life that related to the kinds of attitudes and prejudices and laws and white supremacist violence and everything else that was going on at the time. And to be able to see how it affected a person, from the beginning of her life as an enslaved baby, until she died in 1954, the same year that Brown v. Board was decided. I mean, it's an amazing way to get a large chunk, almost 100 years of American history, and to do it through a life story gives you the understanding of what it means to be an intersectional Black feminist from a personal perspective of looking through her life and her words. And one of the things that she always said is that she talked about intersectionality without using that theoretical word, right? Because she would talk about the fact that she was a Black woman, and so she was experiencing life through the lenses and through the oppression that sexism and racism were affecting her. And so she was always talking about these kinds of things. And so we get a sense of what it means to be living in an intersectional body, like in a world where that's always something that you have to confront. And it explains also the kinds of things that were her priority in terms of her activism as well.
And I really, if you can show through stories, and you do, what this means without the social science jargon that unfortunately is filtered into history. That's my prejudice. It forces the reader, really compels the reader, invites the reader to look at the world through the lens of a 19th and 20th century Black woman. And for a lot of my readers, I think that's going to have much more meaningful impact than unfortunately some of the books that they're reading that I keep criticizing. But in any case, I did want to ask Robert Terrell, Berto, her husband, obviously a very close partnership that they had, and you bring that out, which is wonderful. I was really struck by your acknowledgements and what brought you personally to this project, because in the end, as you know, it's always personal.
Uh-huh. So I feel like those are two different questions, and I can take them one at a time. So the issue with Berto, or her husband, Robert H. Terrell, is he was born enslaved and then managed to move to DC and get himself educated to the point where he was working in Massachusetts and went to Andover and then to Harvard University, where he got a degree and graduated with honors. So this was a pretty big deal at the time.
I should say, sorry to interrupt here, but for my readers, Philip Sandover is like Eton
Yeah.
in America. It's, in fact, most Americans I find are entirely unaware of its existence. It's a very elite boarding school. I'm sorry,
It's
Alison.
no, no, absolutely. I mean, so
Yeah.
he was exceptional at the time in all kinds of ways, and so everyone had told her, "Oh, now that you learned all these foreign languages, and now that you know Latin and Greek, you'll never find a husband." But he wasn't the slightest bit worried about all of her accomplishments because he was equally accomplished and a supporter of suffrage and everything else. And so, one of the points that I would like to say is there were even more letters and materials about her that I didn't know about that were at her family's house in Highland Beach, Maryland, which was a Black beach resort that Frederick Douglass's son Charles had set up, and that they had purchased land right next to the house that was being built for Frederick Douglass right before he died. And so the amazing thing about that is that I was able to go to the family's house, and they shared those documents with me, and I was able to read the love letters between the family, between Mary Church Terrell and her husband, which they had not donated to any of the libraries that have repositories. And after reading them and talking with them and working with them for a while, the family and I decided to have me approach Oberlin College about the possibility of having the papers that they had not yet donated somewhere be given to Oberlin. And Oberlin did have a symposium where they brought the family and me and some other scholars to come and speak about Mary Church Terrell. And then a few years later, there was another big event where more papers were given to them from the family. And it was a rededication of the library as the Mary Church Terrell Library, which also was part of Carmen Ambar's inauguration as the first Black female president of Oberlin College. So it was a very meaningful experience. And that was another side of what to me ended up being a very personal part of it, because I became close with the Terrell family. But then in terms of my own family background and my own history, my mother was a women's studies teacher who ended up bringing all kinds of amazing Black women to school at this private girls' school that she worked at in Los Angeles, where she brought in Shirley Chisholm and Alice Walker and Toni Morrison. And she had been guided by her interest and participation in the civil rights movement when she was teaching at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. So these are all things that, play a big role in my interest in these topics and in having an inspiration of my own.
That's terrific. Alison Parker, thank you so much for taking the time. And as ever, there's so much else to ask, but I appreciate it. Thank you for joining us at Non-Boring History.
Thank you very much.